아시아에서는 경제적 자유를 중시하는 여러 싱크탱크가 있는데 그 싱크탱크를 새로 만들기도 했고 또 그런 활동을 통해서 아시아의 경제적 가치를 높여온 그런 분입니다. 특히 이분은 그 홍콩에서 그러한 라이언 락 인스티튜트를 설립하면서 이 경제적 자유가 왜 중요한지를 알리는 그러한 일을 했어요. 특히 홍콩은 아시아의 관문이었죠. 자유가 얼마나 소중한지 그리고 어떻게 작동하는지를 알리는 중요한 전초적 기지였어요. 그런데 언제부턴가 이 홍콩에서의 그러한 역할이 좀 더 태세하고 지금은 아마도 싱가포르가 그런 역할을 하고 있지 않나 싶습니다. 그런데 이 홍콩은 아주 오랜 기간 아시아의 허브로서 경제적 자유, 이 자유의 중요성을 제도적으로 또 시스템적으로 구현했던 그런 역할을 담당을 했습니다. 그래서 이러한 홍콩의 역할이 자유기업원과 함께 이 자유기업원이 그러한 경제적 자유를 알리는 그러한 역할을 같이 해왔는데요. 바로 이 역할이 이 세계적으로 함께 아틀라스 재단과 함께 역할을 같이 해왔습니다. 그래서 경제자유 네트워크라고 하는 단체를 통해서 전 세계 50개 이상의 단체들이 서로 연합해서 이 자유의 가치가 확산될 수 있는 싱크탱크 연합의 활동을 해왔던 것이죠. 특히 그런 면에서 우리 대한민국에서는 자유기업원이 가장 큰 역할을 했고 홍콩에서는 이 라이언 락 인스티튜트가 그 역할을 담당을 했었습니다. 그래서 그 두 기관은 상호 오랜 기간 동안 서로 방문도 하고 서로 모임에 만나서 이 경제 자유 지수를 논한다든가 하는 그러한 활동을 해왔던 것이죠. 오늘 그러한 그 사이먼 리와 함께 좋은 시간을 갖게 돼서 너무 기쁘고요. 또 대만, 중국을 포함한 아시아에서 이 경제적 자유의 가치가 더 확산이 되고 또 제도의 정착이 잘 됨으로 인해서 우리 아시아인 그리고 세계의 그러한 경제적 가치가 확산될 수 있는 그러한 계기를 마련했으면 좋겠습니다. 오늘 좋은 말씀 함께 들어보고 또 질의응답을 이어서 해보도록 하겠습니다. 환영하고요. 또 함께 주목해 주시기 바랍니다. 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much, and it is my honor to be here today with the Center for Free Enterprise. I remember when I started the Lion Rock Institute in 2004, we have a group of Asian free market organizations, and that was about the beginning of different Asian free market think tanks. And I remember I made a lot of good friends, and is so grateful today to see there are next generations, a lot of young people here. And but for someone from Hong Kong, I have to say, the reason why we started the Lion Rock Institute in 2004 was because we have a sense of urgency back then. A lot of people may ask, okay, for someone from Hong Kong, I think I have to address the issue of what happened since the past 5 or maybe 20 years. When we started the Lion Rock Institute 20 years ago, that was about the beginning of what we see as the decline of economic freedom. It did not happen only in 2019. It did not only happen in 2014. It was a long process. But at the beginning, a lot of people would think that is okay, only a small things here and there. But you see, institutions takes a long time to change, either in the good direction or the bad direction. What happened in Hong Kong, unfortunately, was towards the bad direction. But on the other hand, after 2019, I left Hong Kong in 2020 during COVID. I left Hong Kong, went back to America, and I started to think about what about other major economies, my friends, other think tanks, what are they doing? I went to Singapore a few years back, talked to a good friend of mine over there. we agree on one thing. Sometimes it is very difficult to promote free market ideas in Asia, especially East Asia. Firstly, the economy is actually very good here, except Hong Kong. Hong Kong's economy is really bad. The decline is apparent. You can see, even when you walk on the street, you can feel the difference. But if you look at Taiwan, they have the silicon industry now, and who will think about economic freedom? And even Taiwanese, they will think about South Korea, because South Korea is a major competitor, and South Korea has a much stronger consumer industry than Taiwan. So Taiwanese will say, if we want to learn from someone, we should learn from Korea, or maybe we should learn from Japan. But we all know Japan, Korea, and Taiwan can do better. And of course, if you look at Singapore now, it's on the top of the economic freedom ranking. But if you talk to an ordinary Singaporean and ask him, do you care about economic freedom? He will say, well, we're already quite free. They don't think about improving themselves. This is what my investigation in the past few years revealed to me, is that for smaller East Asian countries, the former tigers, they were successful because of the relative free sector, especially in the SMEs, the small and medium enterprises. At that level, yes, it is relatively free when you compare it against the European countries or even America. However, if you look at the bigger companies, when they scale up, the situation is very different. In America, especially, the major corporations are extremely competitive against each other. So the conglomerates, the big companies, sometimes they fail. Think about big names like General Electric. 50 years ago, that was the greatest American companies, and nowadays no one mentions about GE anymore. It is still a very big company. Think about Boeing, the world's one of the only companies making airplanes. Another is Airbus, which is a state-owned enterprise in Europe. But Boeing can fail as well. Big companies often fail, and this is a good thing if you think about that, because that is when you have new companies coming up. Think about the biggest name we have now in the American technology sector: Google, Meta, Amazon. They are less than 30 years old. And for the really big names that last forever, I can only think of maybe Coca-Cola, maybe a few consumer brands like P&G, but other big companies, they can go downhill. But in East Asia, Singapore is an exception because everything is government. Ironically, it is on top of the Economic Freedom Index. But if you think about Taiwan or Korea or Japan, the major big cartels are always there, and they have the political clout and also the economic influence. The marriage of economic power and political power becomes an issue that is very different from America, where in America or Europe, if you are SMEs, you face a lot of like petty regulations, small stuff that are very difficult to deal with. But at higher level, they compete like very ferociously. So I think That makes our work as economic think tank in East Asia very different from our friends in Europe or North America. Even in Europe and North America, I witnessed a change in how they run think tanks. I remember 20 years ago when I was in the Liberty Forum in New York, we talk about like tariff, we talk about free trade, but nowadays when we are in America, we don't talk about those things anymore. We talk about the cultural aspect. We talk about these new age political movements. It becomes very bipartisan now in the United States. It used to be non-partisan, across the party kind of work for think tanks, but now that is a very different situation. But in East Asia, I think we have to think about a different model. We have to think about a very different way of running our think tanks to promote economic freedom. Because to a lot of people, it is not the government that is the issue. It is the big conglomerates and the political power that is built in to the system. And I remember back in the days when we worked in the Lion Rock Institute, ironically, oftentimes the government is our very close ally, because it was the government that is very really, very concerned about the influence, the power that is exerted by the private sector onto policy. Sometimes they want to open up the market, but they don't have allies. One example is before I left Hong Kong, I worked with the Uber, the car hailing company. They want to get into Hong Kong's market, but the vested interest in the taxi industry is so built into the system that Uber can never get anything done. They try to talk to the government, they try to talk to the legislators. Everyone is sympathetic. Everyone thinks, yes, this is a better model than waiting by the side of the street and waiting to get a taxi. Using an app is a much better and easier way to get things done. But until today, Uber is absolutely illegal in Hong Kong. They are still talking about like whether they should do something about it, but no one can change it. So when I was in Hong Kong and still with the Lion Rock, we try to help people in the government to create the momentum so that the taxi industry has the pressure and Uber might get their way in. So it is a very different story. And even Uber, the friend I work with, they said, Hong Kong, the situation is absolutely absurd. They have never seen a place where the government wants to open up the market, but they cannot because of the commercial interest, which is already controlling the politics. So unfortunately, after that campaign, a lot of things happened in Hong Kong. I have to leave Hong Kong. So the project was kind of abandoned, but recently I was told that there are some positive change. The government is trying to push through the legislation, but it is still in a very early stage. But that is just one example. There are a lot of examples when there are new entrants trying to break into the market, but the existing people trying to bar and ban new entrants from outside. I think that is quite normal, even in other East Asian markets. It is not the government that does not want to change. It is the vested interest in the system that is preventing the change. So I think I would just begin from here. and we can, have a discussion on how, as a think tank, we can help to promote more choices, more freedom for the people and for the new companies that are trying to get into the market. Interestingly, in the past few years, we have revived a discussion about geopolitics, and we again talk about Cold War. If you look at what happened after the World War II, the world was divided into two major camps, right? You have the Western world as promoted by the Americans after the Second World War. On the other hand, you have the Soviet Union and the whole Eurasia constellation of nations. The only exception in Asia, in particular, at that point of time, was Japan, because it was defeated after the World War II, and there was like a nation-building reconstruction effort led by the Americans after the Second World War. But Japan was the exception back then. And the institutional change percolate to other Asian society in the 80s. That is like 30-some years after the end of the Second World War. Think about the institutional change in Korea. It was in the late 80s. And that was exactly the time when Taiwan also underwent the institutional change. So we have a period of government and industrial policy so entwined together for 30 years, creating the institutional interest. Taiwan is an example that I understand better. In those 30 years, the government and the industrial sector kind of goes hands in hands together. And I think there are a lot of similarities amongst these nations. And I think another shock wave came in 97, the Asian financial crisis. That opens up even more countries to institutional change. And this time, if you look at like Malaysia, Indonesia, they are also changing. But the most ironic thing is Singapore being on the top of the list of Economic Freedom Index, and at the same time, it is a democracy, but the government involvement in the economic sector is enormous. I think for these nations, they try to survive, they try to compete, and to be honest, if you look at a global scale, all these nations are doing pretty well. Asia societies are doing much better than Europeans. If you think about the growth and in a lot of different measures, education, healthcare, you name it. But I think our question would be, can we do even better? Think about that. If we are looking at the global population within our area, half of the world's population actually is in India, China, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia is like the world's fourth largest nation. If you bundle together, there is a very high density of population, very high density of talent, very high density of possibility. So there is no reason why Asia is not the center of economic gravity, but it is not. Think about the United States. There are only 330 million people, and it commands 25% of global GDP. If you think about that, Asia has a lot of potential, and the question is, what is holding Asia back? Japan tried to be world's number one in the 80s, but then suddenly it stopped in 1991 and entered into a lost decade. And just very recently, Japan is reviving, but it has passed the demographic golden period. I know a lot of countries here also have the demographic challenge. Korea has a demographic challenge. Taiwan as well, Hong Kong as well, China as well. So how do we address this issue amidst all these like geopolitical talk? And I think the geopolitical talk will eventually be irrelevant in a few years. It was like the Cold War. No one could have predicted the fall of the Soviet Union in 1986, but that was the beginning of it. I think the two-camp situation, the bipolar world, will change in maybe less than 10 years. But the real challenge for us is demographics and why institutionally Asia nations are not catching up to the pace that we have all the infrastructure, we have the best education, the best human capital. Why are the best people going to the United States to join the technology sector, but not here? There's no reason. Now, Singapore is on the top, but it was not because of Singapore improving. It was because Hong Kong was declining. And Hong Kong's decline was a long period. That was the reason why we started this. Otherwise, you don't have to protect economic freedom when it is already at the top, right? But back at the time, we see the danger. The danger being China has a very different political ideology. I remember in one of the discussion I had with another group of MBA students, it was during 2019. And I talked about what happened in Hong Kong, why Hong Kong people are protesting on the street. And there was a student from mainland China, and she asked me, why are you guys so obsessed about politics and freedom? And I told her, perhaps, and then she said, you guys should focus on economic development. And I told her, first, economic development is a very vague term. What do you mean by economic development? I think I understand what she says about economic development. That is producing more stuff at a lower cost. Efficiency. But I told her, to us, economics is not a big factory. Don't ever think about a nation as a big factory where you produce at the lowest cost possible at the highest speed. That is not economic development. Economic development is you have more variety, you have more innovation, and that innovation requires, firstly, people can compete fairly on a level playing field. And secondly, and I think this is the more important aspect, is people can trust each other so that they can cooperate. Transaction cost is what hold back a lot of nations because people cannot trust each other. Therefore, they cannot have the transaction. They cannot have the innovation. So I told that student, I said, you know what? What Hong Kong people was doing on the street was to protect the institution so that we can continue to trust each other, so that we can have the institution to guarantee a fair, level playing ground so that everyone can compete fairly. So that was what we were doing. we were protecting economic prosperity. If you look at economic prosperity as a diversity in opportunities, in what is possible but not yet realized. It used to be fair, more fair than now. I just give you one example. Yesterday, Hong Kong's consumer watchdog issued a report telling the public that it is some Chinese-made bottled water containing contaminants. That is a normal thing, right? For a regulatory body to be public and just publish a scientific study. But what happened was, right after the report is public, that mainland Chinese company issue a threat to the consumer watchdog, and the Consumer Council, the consumer watchdog, has to withdraw the warning and apologize to that company. They say, "Oh, we made a mistake. We should not publish that report," just because that bottled water company is a mainland, powerful, connected brands. So that is the situation in Hong Kong now. And I forgot answering about Taiwan's situation. Taiwan is now the second, I think, free economy in Asia. Interestingly, if I look at Taiwan, at a very grassroots level, if we talk about entrepreneurship for everyday people, like if you want to start a small business, it is relatively free. There are a lot of really small, petty regulatory costs. Their labor regulation is notorious, really bad. They have some very silly labor regulations. But generally speaking, it is not very difficult to start a business in Taiwan. And it is not very difficult to survive. But it is very difficult to scale up. Small business stays small almost forever. I don't know, probably the situation is similar here. The fact that small business cannot access to capital and scale up, I think, is a problem that troubles all of us. Taiwan, Korea, and even other South Asian economies. And this is also something that I am very interested about, and in the long run, I might look into it. But capital is not only about money. Capital is not about, like, I have money so that I can buy machines and do stuff. Capital is risk-taking. Capital is ultimately is about taking risk. Just think about that. If you are a farmer and you start getting in equipment so that your productivity increase, you grow more stuff. But the problem is, if everyone does the same thing, everyone productivity increases, the price will go down. You might not capture what you have invested at the first place, right? That is risk. But this risk-taking is good for the whole economy. But you do have to have someone with that kind of risk appetite to invest in all these new technology method that increases your economies of scaling up. But whenever you have people, everyone is trying to scale up and drive down the price, someone will fail. Someone will run into business failure. But that is a good thing. That means the market is competitive. Going back to what I shared earlier, if you look at what happened in the United States, they have extremely competitive capitalist market, especially at the very top. On the contrary, there are like small shops. They start maybe as a mom and pop shop selling sandwiches. And 10 years, if they're good enough, 10 years from then, they scale up. They started to become chain. They started to become franchise. They started to grow like nationally. They have the capacity. I think one of the challenge for us here as well is because our market, well, actually our markets are not small. Think about Korea, right? Is a big market on a global scale. Taiwan is a mid-sized nation. 23 million people is not a small country, but the scaling up is very difficult. So I think it is not just about the government, but it has a lot to do with the financial institution. I remember in 2008, it was a little out of context, but in 2008, someone made a very good point about capitalism. It says capitalism without failure is like religion without sin. For those of you who are Christian, probably you can get it more deep down in your heart. But in capitalism, the essence is actually failure. Because of the competition, you need to have this process of finding out what is not working. In our culture, I think generally in Asia culture, because of the risk aversion, we more tends to go for methods or business model that is already working. So if we see something working, then we'll just keep doing it. We might perfect it. We might try to improve our existing method, our existing business model, little by little, incremental improvement. But very seldom we see disruptive innovation coming from traditional society or more conservative society like ours. We are more an adopter and follower of what is going on in elsewhere. So we see other countries are doing internet, then we start doing internet. We see someone started a company called Google, then maybe in China they have a look-alike. In the United States, there is an Amazon. So in China, they have Alibaba. So they are trying to adopt, and copy is the word, but they try to adopt the whatever being invented elsewhere and make it better. And even Japanese are like that. Japanese were known for taking whatever being done by the outside world, but do it even better. That is kind of an Asia thing. Asians people are very good at doing that. Just make it better than the originator. However, at the end of the day, we need to have the disruptive mindset. I also noticed one thing: engineers with an Asia background and engineers who are like Western European or Americans, they think very differently. Perhaps that has to start all the way back to education and the cultural mindset. I think especially in our cultural setup, think tanks should really differentiate prosperity in terms of efficiency versus innovation. We are absolutely the most efficient part of the world. Think about everything being done here in Asia. It is just like what I said, better than they do in America, better than what they do in Europe better than anywhere else. Efficiency is our strong suit. It is not that difficult for Asia economies to become prosperous because of the efficiency. What we lack is the innovation, is the risk-taking, is the competition. And I think not only just competition, but also if we look at the Industrial Revolution, especially the second Industrial Revolution during 19th century, if you compare America versus British, you notice something very weird. Although British was the originator of Industrial Revolution and British was already at the peak of the economic power and the trade network and everything, but America eventually surpassed the British because of two things. Firstly, the market is more diverse horizontally. So in America, if you have an industrial product, eventually in the hands of the consumers, even back in the 19th century, you will find parts produced by different factories, by different owners, and being assembled together. And that was a very American thing. So they allowed this horizontal cooperations, and that is a very, very big difference. And secondly, the financial market back then in both nations, in the United States and in the Britain, there was a very vibrant financial market. But if you look at the number of financial crises, it was actually more prevalent on the American side. Almost they have a financial crisis every 10 years, even without major geopolitical conflict. And that kind of economic bubble, of course, from an Austrian economic point of view, we blame the government for printing too much money and extend the credits too easily. But if you look at what happened in America back in the 19th century, it was private credit. The economic bubble, there are a lot of shenanigans, there are a lot of scams. But out of all these scams, sometimes you have one or two things that turns out to be useful. And that one, two things, that small, very small percentage of innovations eventually drive the development. If you look at early automobile industry, there were like a lot of companies trying different ways of producing cars. But eventually there was one called Ford that standardized everything and creates the whole manufacturing system that transform American industry. So if we think about that, in our role here, probably we need to deepen the discussion on our industrial policy, not just talking about prosperity or absolute GDP terms, but we need to address the issue of innovation and disruption. We need to defend sometimes things that might look silly, like economic failure, like crisis, because no one knows beforehand. Some of those new innovations might work or they might not work. But if you do not let them have a chance to give it a try in the market, then they will never succeed. The rate of success is very low. That is why we need capitalism that can take the risk. Basically, I think there are a lot of similarities there. Most people, they don't really care, to be honest. To them, they care about what happens to them first. Unless you really have a imminent crisis like what we had in Hong Kong a few years ago. Otherwise, most people, they believe in, regardless of their age group or regardless of what they do, they believe in something in the middle of the road, something wishy-washy. But there is a very special circumstance in Hong Kong, that is, we have a very strange understanding of economic freedom, especially given there is a backstory here. I think most people know the Economic Freedom Index, right here. Anyone knows when was the Economic Freedom Index started to compile? We are old enough. Yeah, actually it dates back to 95 because we use old data, right? But 1997. And the introduction of the index is a very curious time. And Milton Friedman proposed to introduce the index, right? And this is my speculation. I tried to ask the people in Cato and Heritage. No one can give me a definite answer. But 1997 was also the time when Hong Kong was handed back to China. And Milton Friedman has a very special passion about Hong Kong. In the Free to Choose TV series, he went to Hong Kong and said, hey, this is the most free economy in the world. I was too little back then, but some of my older academic friends told me in 1978, I was 2 years old. In 1978, there was a Mount Pelerin Society meeting in Hong Kong. Hayek and Friedman, and I remember Harbinger, a few like big names in economics, went to Hong Kong. And 1978 was the year China changed its policy to open door. So, moving forward to 1997, the introduction of the Economic Freedom Index, if you look into the details of how the index is compiled, I complained many times to them, you guys make it so difficult for any other countries to compete because Hong Kong is a city-state. Singapore is a city-state. Korea is a nation. Japan is a nation. You are comparing blueberries to watermelons. How can you compare these two fruits? They say, we have been doing that for many years, since 97. And then I come to this realization that, hey, how curious that they introduced it at 97. And my personal speculation is Milton Friedman really wants to protect Hong Kong as it was. He knew after handing Hong Kong back to China, things might change. There needs to be a measurement. It is like, you know, the tide is coming. You know that there will be flood coming up. So you have a measurement by the riverside to see the water rising. If you see the water rising, it's not right. And you can have early warning to the people. And I think that was the reason why they introduced the Economic Freedom Index. And this is why after 2019, the Heritage Foundation was the first to drop Hong Kong from the list. And we're done with Hong Kong. Well, actually, there are pressure, even if you make a joke about anything. But I can speak from the perspective of like being a Hong Konger, and also I know a lot of good friends like the Uniru in China. They've been running the think tank in Beijing, I think since the 90s. Professor Mao Yishi was the president at the beginning, and the Uniru Institute was forced to close in 2014. So that was like a gradual repercussions on first in China and then to Hong Kong, and eventually to the other people, not even in China. That is a gradual process. And if there's one message I love to share with the people, that is really we have to cherish the freedom we have, no matter it is a political freedom or economic freedom, because don't take it for granted. If we look at history of human civilization, freedom is an exception rather than the norm. For the majority of human history, we do not live free. It is a new thing. I would say we can do much better, always, given the amount of resources in Asia. Asia should be much more prosperous. If we look at our surrounding, actually we are living quite well here, but can we be even better? Definitely. Although there are a lot of problems in society we need to address. I think all societies, they have so-called inequality problem. They have housing problem. Everywhere in big cities, you have housing problems. It is not a government issue. A lot of people want to, like, whenever they come across any issues, they will say, oh, can the government do something? But then after debating all these policy issues for so many years, I realized one thing. When you begin to compare different societies at a probably similar situation, then you see they have similar problems. We have housing problem here. We have housing problem in Taiwan. We have housing problem in Hong Kong. We have housing problem in San Francisco and in New York City. And the reason being, in big cities, although you still have land, you can have urban spiral, people can move to the suburbs, but transportation is adding to the cost of living. So rich people tends to live in the closer to the CBD, and those areas will become so expensive for normal people to afford. And you know what? It is a natural phenomenon. How can government address a natural phenomenon? So one of our job as a think tank, I think, is to tell the people that if you come across a phenomenon, don't call it a problem first. Understand why it happens. And then if you understand, hey, perhaps it is a cost to pay when civilization progress, but up to a certain point, we will have a solution. That is not governmental. Work from home is a solution. People have been advocating for that even before COVID. So people advocate work from home to solve the housing crisis in big cities. That is a non-governmental solution. Of course, you can say, hey, can we have a more lenient labor policy so that people can really work from afar? And that would eventually have an impact on other labor policy. Oh, if we can all work from home, how about I can hire someone from overseas? How about I can do some labor cost arbitrage? Then eventually you will think, oh, every single solution comes at a cost.
네, 오늘 행사는 여기서 마무리를 하려고 하고요. Okay, we will conclude today's event here. And Simon, could you share your some closing remarks with us?
I'm so happy to be in a think tank that promotes economic freedom, especially in Asia in a very important place, not only because I am an Asian, but because I think if the world needs to progress, it has to be from different parts of the world. The world progress because we have diversity, because more people are contributing to the network of innovations. And I hope it does not only come from just one nation in North America, but from more different nations, and the competition will eventually benefit everyone in this planet. I once had this very strange thought about what if, because nowadays a lot of people watch sci-fi and they talk about some aliens species exist outside our planet. The first thing I think is, if there is another species, another race of intelligent being, the first thing most people think about is invasion. They will go to like destroy our world. But the first thing I think about is, why don't we think about trade? Why don't we think about commerce? No one talked about that. But what can we exchange with them? Of course, they are in a much higher technology, but maybe tourism is a market for them, right? They want to see something different. They want to have our food or something. So think about that. The more open different nations to commerce and exchange, the more possibilities there are. You know, if you have aliens visiting our planet, we give them some good food, tteokbokki or something, they might pay us in technology that we never thought about. So I think if there's one really important thing is, I really hope that we can realize our potential as Asia economy. The promise back in the 90s was this is going to be the Asia century. And it should be.